Encountering a game which is new to you could typically go one of two ways. Either you discover something which you fall in love with and add it to your games to playlist, or you bounce off it, either until you try again in the future, or maybe don't go back at all. The latter was very much my first experience when encountering Pastfinder in my early days of messing about with C64 emulators during the 1990s. But I did come back to it more than a few years later, and giving it a second look happened to convince me there's more to it than what those first impressions might have offered. Seeing release in 1984, Pastfinder was developed by David Lubar for the Atari 8-bit line of computers and published by Activision. Going alongside this Atari release was a conversion to this Commodore 64, with one also appearing on MSX computers after that. For the sake of convenience and what time I have, the Atari and Commodore 64 versions are what I'm going to be focusing on in this video. Unsurprisingly, for an early 1980s computer game, Pastfinder doesn't have much of a story. It's space year 8878, and you're seeking admission to the Pastfinders, a group who explore worlds for artifacts left behind by long-departed civilizations. You start the game arriving at one such world, and must scour the surface for those precious artifacts, whilst avoiding the abandoned defences, before depositing your finds within the stations conveniently located around the planet. Your first port of call is the map screen, and this shows all the sectors available to you. This includes those you have explored previously, along with the unexplored ones, which are colour-coded to indicate how radioactive they are. The first task is to choose which sector you want to tackle, which could be any of those immediately around your current position. With a direction plotted, your next step is to prepare yourself for the sector ahead by choosing one of several tools to activate. These are limited in use though, so you're going to have to watch out for more of them as you go about your travels. The journey between sectors might look like a walk in the park, at least early on. But then you get the hazards. Sectors will carry a variety of obstacles, from walls and barriers which need to be negotiated, to pieces of infrastructure that you can blast for points. Most important are the hovering crystals. As you journey on, you'll accumulate radiation, the rate of which depends on the sector. Take on too much, and you're going to lose one of your lives. Should you encounter one of these crystals and blast it, it'll wipe off a bunch of radiation from you. Of course, artifacts are the most important thing to prioritise, and they can be found lying about on their own or in packs of 5. I dig how this brings a risk-reward factor to the proceedings here, as once you reach a base or a station to deposit them, you'll get a period of invulnerability or being free of radiation based on the number of artifacts you deposit. The biggest threat though really comes from the enemies. Particularly as you're making progress up the map, they'll start to send more and more craft at you, and you can either evade them or take them out. Helping this are a couple of the tools that you've got access to earlier. The Scrambler, which will prevent them locking onto you. They won't directly home in on your path as they travel down the screen. And the Beam Shield, well, that'll shield you from damage should they actually land a shot on you. Though to be honest, while the Scrambler was pretty neat, I didn't find the Beam Shield all that helpful. Evasion better suited my tactics as I made my way through the game. And I sort of touched upon this earlier, but avoiding death is important, because not only do you lose one of your lives, but you also lose half the artifacts you're carrying. So if you've been stockpiling a lot to get to a base as you're trying to find one, you're going to lose a lot as a result. Thankfully, earning more lives is pretty easily. New ones are earned at every multiple of 5,000 points, and that might sound like a low score target, but plenty of work is needed to earn those points. There is a second method, and this one requires careful navigation plotting. When you view the map, you have an indicator presented at the bottom which consists of 2 arrows. These give you a vertical and horizontal offset of the sector where an extra life is located relative to your position. When you've reached that sector, all you need to do is have a careful eye to find them as you're working your way through. And again, this also adds that risk-reward mechanic, which I feel is really important with Pastfinder. Do you risk losing lives in order to obtain more of them? Or would you rather carry on and focus on surviving with what you've got to hand? In fact, making frequent decisions like this helps make Pastfinder a game which is more than the sum of its parts. It also stands out against Activision's catalogue of the time as well. Many of those other games tended to offer simpler mechanics, and when starting out with Pastfinder, it does add to the challenge, and it probably contributed to why I initially bounced off the game. I do find this challenge rewarding though. Clearing a sector with your radiation meter close to maxing out will give you a giant sigh of relief. And of course, you've got tools to mitigate that. The heavy shield slows the rate of absorption, and you can purge all your radiation as well. And of course, that feeling is something that's also shared when you deliver a significant number of artifacts to a friendly base. Especially because at first, you're navigating blind to finding them. Once you complete a few laps of the map, they will slowly be added to it. So early on, there's actually a bit of that blindness as you're exploring. So it adds to the challenge and the tension as you manage to find one before you've done those laps. It's a really good way of just building up what happens. You get invested in it. So as you'd expect for an Activision game of this time, both these Atari and Commodore 64 versions are fairly close to each other. Strategies I happened to develop when playing on one machine did work when played on the other. And this doesn't surprise me all that much. Many of Activision games, compared to other publishers, were always really consistent across the various machines these games were ported and converted to. Pathfinder differs from this in a couple of areas though, namely the graphics and the sounds. It's no surprise to see that the original Atari version of the game really uses those colour capabilities well. It stands out quite a lot with each sort of grouping of sectors having its own distinct palette for the background, the walls and obstacles and everything. It really helps bring an element of distinction to them, and it sort of helps you grade how difficult a sector is as a result. You know by certain sector colours that they're going to be harder than the others. On the Commodore 64 version, it does look good enough, but the smaller palette of the C64 does limit things here, and I'm not going to lie, choosing grey as the background colour for those opening sectors really doesn't give it a good first impression. I'm not going to lie about that. It just doesn't make it feel as lively as the Atari version of the game does. And this kind of carries on with the sound. As much as I love the C64 SID for what composers could do with it, at least musically, there is a bit more finesse needed to when it comes to crafting good sound effects. Which is sadly the case here with Pastfinder. Particularly the sound which plays when a drone is coming. It's something I can't help but find incredibly shrill to listen to as I was playing more and more in, especially whilst I was trying to blast stuff. The general blasting sound effects and the background warble and that drone alarm kind of irritated me a bit. Which didn't really happen on the Atari version. The sounds were far more pleasant to listen to, and I guess that's part of the sort of background of the Pokey's roots and design. But sound is really an important factor in games, and many of our favourites rely on good sound to craft memorable experiences. So, depending on your tolerance for that kind of sound, maybe the C64 version will be a little irritating to play as well. But let's start drawing things to a close. Pastfinder might not be as approachable as other Activision games of the time, but give it a chance and you'll find it blends the frenetic action with a tactical approach of planning that you need to factor in. You have to juggle your resources and manage them in order to survive as long as you can. This is really important for success. Sure, you might be great with the joystick during the planetary sequences, but if you can't manage your resources and use them right at the right time, you're not going to survive long enough to really make progress. And of course, if you do use those resources well, you plan them to use them efficiently, but you're not great with the action side of things, well, it's all going to be for naught, because you're just going to lose too many lives trying to negotiate stages. I think it's a sign of tight game design that challenges both sides of your brain, and I'm totally here for it. So, in closing up, give Pastfinder a shot, and let's go talk about it in the comments. I do hope you enjoyed. I think it's so much more interesting to enjoy these games away from their nostalgia and appreciate what they can do, what they offer, and maybe try something new. And if you love what I'm doing with this series, whether it's introducing you to an interesting kind of game, or helping you give something a second chance and maybe giving it some real appreciation, then go down below and see how you can help keep it going. Even a passion project like this series does take a lot of time and effort, and hearing from people really helps keep the momentum going, especially with the darker clouds that are around us. Support comes from multiple ways, and that's really just the tip of it. So what's left for me to say than to just say thank you all very much for watching.